as we do this, as we go into this Sunday, what we're doing is we're looking at the third miracle of Jesus' 10 miracles. And he does these 10 miracles in what we're calling the valley. He first begins on the mountain. He expresses the rules of the kingdom. This is how it works. You love your neighbor. He gives us the Beatitudes, which is Christianity 101. If you can get the Beatitudes down, you're better than I am. It's a challenge, but he expresses all these words, and these people they're stunned into silence at how radical his words are compared to the religious system they had built. And they turn everything on their head. And he comes off the mountain, and the people are speechless, and he's going to show now with power that he had the authority to say those words. And so his first two miracles, they represented the dramatic inclusion of the outsiders and the marginalized. It's those who the Jews had dismissed for one reason or the other. And then last week we took some extra time to tackle the idea that only Matthew gives us, is the idea of outer darkness, where people grieve in the outer darkness. The focus of Matthew's gospel, time and again, is on reconsidering who is in and who is out. And how far in are you? He started way back when he hits on the genealogy of Jesus, and he brings in Gentiles into Jesus' genealogy, and not only Gentiles, but he brings women in to say these are the people who have also been in. And what this becomes in Matthew is he's expressing that some might actually be better off with God than the Jews thought they were. Others might not be as well off as the Jews thought the Jews were. And it began in Matthew chapter 3, verse 9. We don't have this on a slide, but John the Baptist has some Jewish leaders come to him. And John the Baptist, he tells the Jewish leaders, you can't just skate by on claiming that Abraham is your father. It doesn't work that way. It's not just what's in your blood. And there's this general idea among the Jews, and especially among the most prestigious, the ruling class Jews, that Abraham had secured them a place by default as the most prestigious with God. And they'd be at the top of the pecking order. And I can picture that they believe they'd be there thumbing their nose like this at all those who are outside. They'd be like little kids, like, that everyone else is out there. And they had this prestigious place with God. But Jesus last week paints a different picture, where the imagery is of a hero's banquet, of the greatest of God's people. And he names the top three: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And obviously, if the Jews were to place themselves somewhere with God, if there was such a banquet, they would say by default, by our blood, we are in this hero's banquet, of course. But the Jews are not included by default, because what qualifies you as a hero with God, what places you as prestigious with him, is not your blood, it's not by default, it's by your faith. It's by how you live. It's by how you walk out the Sermon on the Mount. It was by faith that Abraham was of Ur, and he left his house to seek God in a foreign land. And it then was by faith that the centurion of Rome left his house to go seek God among a foreign people, the Jews. And so the centurion exemplifies Abraham and exemplifies what it really is that will put you in the hero's banquet. And Jesus says that this doesn't mean that the Jews who he calls of less faith, he's finding faith among the Jews. He's finding people who are intrigued, who are curious, who are learning, who are following. He's finding disciples. He doesn't mean, though, that you of less faith are completely out. We know this because Matthew refers to the Jews of lesser faith, still with the term that he later will use to talk about the good seed, the people who did have faith. But Jesus does warn them that if they don't take a realistic look at themselves, they will one day realize that they weren't at the level they thought they were, simply by their genetics. And that will be a sad realization for many of them to come to realize that you had the chance for so much more, and you settled comfortably to rest comfortably on what was in your blood rather than what you could do for the world, rather than how you could live. In other words, the sad day of realization, so to speak, it's pictured as the day that the heavenly hero award banquet takes place. And the Jews realize that the master of ceremonies says, sorry guys, you need to go out from this. You weren't invited to this. This is for the prestigious people. And the Jews go out into what is called the outer darkness, when they realize that they could have been there if they wouldn't have just begun to live a life of complacency on the old, hundreds-year-old work of Abraham. Finally, we can't take this literally. The place of outer darkness, we can't take it literally as if these are literal places either within the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of heaven and a literal place of hell. We can't take the outer darkness as referring to a literal place. Jesus rarely, if ever, spoke of these things literally. This is not, as far as we know in context, a literal banquet hall and a literal place of night outside the door. Jesus is simply using this as a picture to draw his audience to the idea, and us now, that we need to consider, I'm in. In other words, I've crossed the threshold, but have I now become complacent with my life? Am I now not living how great of a life this should be, this could be? Is there so much more that I could be experiencing, but I'm leaving out of my experience? If there was a banquet tomorrow for the likes of Abraham, am I under the prideful, false impression that I am at the level of Abraham? I was in the Army and everybody wants to be special forces, but it takes work to get there. And those who grow complacent, who let themselves go physically, you can make the minimum. You can be in the Army by the minimum, but that doesn't mean that you will also get to then say, I get to rise to the level of those people. And so Jesus is saying, you're of little faith. You met the minimum. You're in. But there's so much more you can shoot for and live for. On the heels of the faith challenge by Jesus to all of us, exemplifying the centurion, Jesus moves to his next miracle. And we'll read it in Matthew chapter 8, verses 14 through 17. When Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she got up and began to serve him. That evening, they brought to Jesus many who were possessed by demons. And he cast out the spirits with a word, and he cured all who were sick. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took our infirmities, and he bore our diseases. The third miracle takes place at Peter's house, and it involves a woman. We've gone through the outsiders from a leper to a Gentile, and now we come to the outsider of a woman. And remember what I said, that we need to let Matthew speak for Matthew. And realize that Matthew's saying much more than simply writing down some points of history that might be interesting to us. We know this because the miracles are put in different orders by different gospel writers. He orders this for a purpose because he has a deeper lesson here. And so we're not looking for a historical timeline, but we're looking for history to be used to teach us something that we don't see explicitly in the miracles themselves. In Matthew's case, he has placed these first three miracles of the 10 in what I want to call temple order. He places them in a different order than you're going to find in the other Gospels. And he has put these in temple order. And we see this by looking at a diagram of the temple. We have a diagram of the temple on a slide so we can picture it. And so here's the temple, if you can see it. Looks like we can see it pretty well. Lepers, the first miracle. They would not even get into the main area of the temple, the plaza that would be outside where the light is shining out of the doorway. They wouldn't even get into the plaza. Lepers were banished from this altogether. Gentiles, exemplified by the centurion, they could get into the plaza where some light is spilling out of the doors. The Gentiles could get a little closer. You got into the plaza and there was called the court of the Gentiles. If you were not a Jew, this is as far as you could go, but you were included more than the leper. Women, the Jewish women, they could go a little further into the first area of light. Not the tall building on the right, but the first area of light. They could go in a little closer. In there was the court called the women's court, the court of the women. This is the first place where the light actually is. Only men, Jewish men, could enter into the building that you see on the right, where you have the holy place and then the Holy of Holies. The men were the ones allowed to get the closest to God, specifically the Jewish men. We remember that in Jesus' greater life, Matthew, he's recording Jesus' journey to Jerusalem, with Jerusalem as the climax. Matthew only has Jesus go to Jerusalem once in Matthew's timeline, because Matthew wants us to see Jerusalem as the pinnacle of Jesus' ministry. So Matthew's whole book is a journey of Jesus. But these first three miracles of Jesus, as Matthew's laid them out, is also a journey of Jesus. Here in the first three miracles of Jesus, he's set up a journey of Jesus walking through the layers of those who have been kept away from God by the Jews. From the 11th century, an ancient French theologian, his name is Anselm of Laon. He's one who recognized the order of Matthew's miracles as Jesus' regathering or reversing social exclusion, religious exclusion. And Jesus begins with the most scattered bits of humanity because Jesus begins on the outside of the temple. And so Jesus begins with the most scattered bits of humanity in general that are represented by the leper. These are the ones who are the most banished. And Jesus begins at the outermost. And then he begins to move in from the outside. Jesus moves to the next layer of defense. He breaks down the first walls and he moves to the next layer of defense because really this is what the walls of exclusion are, right? These are defensive walls. They are barriers that are set up not so much for the benefit of those outside, but the barriers are styled to keep safe the general comfort and the sensitivities of those inside. They don't want to come to deal with the discomfort of being shocked and offended by those horrible people who we put outside our walls. These are defensive walls. The tearing down of the next defensive wall is exemplified by Jesus' actions with the Gentile centurion. He goes from the outside to the next layer, which is the Gentile court. And he continues to move through. He's taking in temple order. He's taking a journey. And now Jesus comes to the next layer of comfortable exclusion, the women. This is reflected by Peter's mother-in-law. And these three healings, they're intentionally laid out by Matthew to reflect a theological journey of Jesus. And notice that Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, didn't come in reverse order. He doesn't come in the order as if he was always in the holiest place where they believed God always dwelled. He doesn't come from the center of the temple where the Jews thought they had boxed up and protected God from everyone else, because God was never there. Last week, I went to a pastor's conference where the speaker reflected on the idea that the glory of God had never come to fill the second temple. The speaker reflected that despite the Jews acting as if they had bottled up God's holiness within this temple and safely contained him away, the pastor at the conference I went to last week said, yeah, his glory never went there. And sadly, there was an audible gasp. From many of the pastors, from this room of pastors, there was an audible gasp as they learned this. Many of the shocked, if not all of the pastors who gasped, many of them, they've been pastoring for years. And yet they had never read this important detail and realized this. This is an important lesson from our sacred scriptures. That God, the lesson that God will not be found within our defensive walls to maintain our comfort and keep God safe. My experience has been in line with the observation of a Pentecostal theologian called Chris Green, that in general, not all the time, I know of many great exemptions to this rule, but in general, among the most militant biblicists, leaders that I've met, as such, were in that room of pastors that I was with. There's often a failure to pay attention to detail, and theology will often lag behind. Theology is what we know about God. Doug Clay, who he currently leads the Assemblies of God, he wrote an article this month about the need for a renewal of theology among pastors. In his article, he quoted C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis warned that the opposite of theology is not that you have no idea about God. The opposite of theology, when you say, well, there's no theology here, is actually there is theology. You have a bad idea about God. So the opposite of theology is not no idea. The opposite of good theology is bad theology. Doug is right as he goes on to say that we can't simply feel our way to God, taking along with us a grab bag of some ideas from Scripture. He does comment that pastors must, more than ever, seek to build theology because that's the good picture of God. And this means, to build this theology, paying attention to the details. The detail here that informs our theology so that we can have right ideas about God is that for God to come and take a peek at what the humans had magnificently built and thought that they had defined and contained God within, for their safety and security, for God to take a peek at this, he has to come from where he was, on the outside, and journey to go check this out. What did they build for me? Where do they say I am? Jesus makes the same journey to the temple that God first made to the Tower of Babel. The scholars' consensus is that the Tower of Babel was not a literal tower like we picture in a children's book. Often the Tower of Babel in a children's book is a circular tower with stairs going around it, and they're trying to get all the way to the atmosphere. The consensus of scholars was that this is not what was actually being built. Rather, the Tower of Babel, it was a man-made mountain. The term for it is a ziggurat. And we know that these were made in the ancient Middle East, and it was believed that gods lived on top of mountains in the ancient world. And so the people, they build the Tower of Babel. They make a man-made mountain in order, the scripture says, to make a name for themselves. They will make a city around a man-made mountain to which they can then make a name for themselves, gaining a claim because they're making a place for God to live in their midst. And they will be the city within which God lives. And the joke of the story of the Tower of Babel is that God has to come over, cross a geographical distance to see the mountain that was supposedly made where he's living. Let me go see this mountain that they say I'm going to live in. And so the joke of the story of the Tower of Babel is that God has to come over and see this thing because he's not really there where they think they're going to contain him. To see how this comes to the experience of Jesus with the temple. Just like the Tower of Babel, Matthew is showing God as Jesus, who has to cover the religious distance from the furthest away he can be from the man-made mountain. He has to cover the religious distance from all the way in the furthest circle to come check out the temple where the people claimed he was already housed. And it was the pride of the Jewish people that they claimed they had housed God on their mountain. For me, when I saw this, I picture the Bugs Bunny cartoon with Elmer Fudd hunting Bugs Bunny, and Elmer thinks he has Bugs trapped. And he's looking in a hole with his gun, and he's like, he's right here. Elmer Fudd says, I have Bugs Bunny right here, and he's at the hole. And who do we see coming from behind him? Bugs Bunny, munching on a carrot, coming up behind Elmer Fudd, and he taps Elmer Fudd on the shoulder, and he says, hey, Elmer, hey, Doc, what's up? Elmer discovers he didn't have Bugs trapped where he thought he had Bugs trapped. The Jews have repeated the Tower of Babel with their temple. And Matthew illustrates God as Jesus, like Bugs, coming over behind them to lean on their shoulder and check things out. What is this place? Well, it's where you live. That's where I live? That's where I'm contained? That's where you've trapped me? Instead, he had to come from the furthest regions outside of this place. So the Jews, like Elmer, they're focused inwards theologically and to a physical box where they have pride that they have contained God. And God, in the details of this story, if we read the details, God is discovered to have never been in their box. In fact, if we're meant to picture a single place where God is to be found, God was first with those who had been pushed furthest away. It's from this place as far away as you could theologically get from the box, making the point that then the box had no pull on me. It didn't even pull me a little close. I'm as far away theologically as you can get from this box. God comes walking up behind those who had maintained their closest position to the box. And he knocks down the walls of exclusion as he comes. Knocks down the walls of defending my comfort and my complacency. So Jesus comes to knock down the next defensive wall as he comes to Peter's sick mother-in-law. In all ways, women were viewed as less than men in the ancient culture. Their lives were worth less, they were esteemed less, and they were even considered to be less intelligent. Particular to our miracle now, women were held at a distance from God's central place in the temple. They had been excluded. And there was even a rabbinic rule against a man touching a woman's hand. So here comes God, Jesus, coming close to the women who the men had been trying to keep away from him. And God, as a man, extends his hand to touch a woman, Peter's mother-in-law. Time and again, Jesus breaks down the defenses that the religious elite have built. This is particularly highlighted with how Jesus treats women. There's a special wall that Jesus is working on breaking down with women. A thread to these miracles of Jesus has been his eagerness to heal people, making them all equal. You're not on the furthest outside, and so I'm less eager to heal you. He begins with the leper, showing the leper says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus says, I'm willing. Let's do this. He moves from the leper to the Gentile, and Jesus' eagerness is even exposed more. His eagerness is exposed more as Jesus reveals his desire to go out of his way to help. Your son is sick. Let's go to your house. I will take a detour. Let's go to your house and make your son well. And finally, a woman is used to show that Jesus is so eager to help, he will do so without even being asked. There's no question asked in Matthew's gospel. We'll find that Jesus treats women in a manner that is actually more elevated very often than men. In this case, German Catholic theologian Nocke, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, points out that in this miracle, it is only a woman who is the only one to get Jesus' only ever unrequested or unsought miracle. Peter's mother-in-law gets a miracle that was never asked for. She didn't even seek it. Jesus elevates women throughout his ministry to break down the walls of male defense. This will continue as we looked at in the past, where Jesus sends a woman to go preach the message of the resurrection to men. As we bring this to a conclusion or to a close today, in the next 5 or so minutes, I want to note that this miracle is the shortest of all 10 miracles, but that doesn't make it the least. Rather, this is the culminating miracle of inclusivity. It's the shortest because Matthew has edited it down to put his final sharp point on it, to ram his point home of the message he's trying to tell. And Matthew is using a woman to preach the final point of Matthew's message, just like Jesus will use a woman to preach the resurrection. The message of Peter's mother-in-law, it actually resembles a point because it's built in what is called a chiastic structure, where the point is found dead center in the story. We have that on this slide here. The story of Peter's mother-in-law flows like this. Jesus enters, he sees the fever, and he touches Peter's mother-in-law's hand. The fever leaves, and Jesus is then served. The topics go to a point, and then they reflect each other as they come out. The point of the story is made at Jesus' touch. And a woman's story is used to tell this message. Contact with Jesus is the turning point of this story. And it's the turning point of every one of Jesus' miracles. This is the intended message that Matthew wants us to get. This is why I try to take the importance of Jesus' touch into account when I give messages. You'll rarely hear me putting my foot down and preaching at anyone. I'm not trying to touch you. I'm trying to bring an introduction to Jesus, to you. My goal is always to bring people in contact with Jesus, because it's not my thoughts, it's not my words, it's not my opinions that are going to change people. It's encountering, being touched by Jesus. And this is the point of these 3 miracles that is driven home by the point of a woman's story. Contact with Jesus brings a miracle to the leper as Jesus demonstrates mercy rather than legal adherence. Contact with Jesus brings the centurion a miracle as Jesus demonstrates his mercy is not limited by ethnic lines. And contact with Jesus brings Peter's mother-in-law a miracle as Jesus demonstrates his mercy ignores social status. We read on after the healing of Peter's mother-in-law that Jesus healed many more people in that evening. And Matthew points out that Jesus healed them with a word. It's with mass healings here that we connect Jesus' words back to Matthew 4:23 and 25, where mass healings were spoken of right before the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew is an excellent writer who bookends with mass healings a section of Scripture. This section involves the Sermon on the Mount and then 3 miracles of power to support Jesus' story of who he is, his claimed words that left people speechless, his power to speak them, and that prove Jesus' doing. That I said the words and now I will live by my words. I will leave these out for you. And so Matthew bookends a section of Scripture, but Matthew's an excellent writer, and he simultaneously bookends one section, but he also uses the end of one section to bring us into another. Because these are the first 3 miracles of a total of 10. That's its own section of Scripture. Before we go on to another miracle, and we'll close with this. Jesus is approached by a scribe who wants to become a disciple. He's also approached with a disciple who wants to take some time away from Jesus. What we'll see with these two is that Jesus takes approaches personal to each person. Jesus reflects for us God in the flesh, a personal God who knows you personally and speaks to you uniquely. This experience is only 4 sentences. And let's read it. In Matthew 8:18 through 22. Now, when Jesus saw great crowds around him, he gave orders to go to the other side of the lake. Jesus is on the side of a lake right now. So he gave orders to go to the other side of the lake. A scribe then approached and said, "Teacher, I'll follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Another of his disciples said, "Lord, let me go for a bit and bury my father." But Jesus said to him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their dead." A zealous scribe comes to Jesus, and Jesus gives him cause to hesitate before actually becoming a disciple. Jesus gives cause to maybe not follow me so much. The scribe says he'll go wherever Jesus goes, and in a play on words, Jesus matches the exaggeration and simply says, "I have nowhere. I have nowhere to lay my head. You'll go wherever I go, and I have nowhere." So he warns the scribe, but despite the warning, it does appear that the scribe became a disciple of Jesus. Because when we transition to the next person, in Matthew 8:21, we're told the next person is another disciple. So the scribe comes and says, "I want to be your disciple." And Jesus says, I got nowhere to go. But it seems the scribe became a disciple because then we read another disciple comes. So the scribe apparently became a disciple. As opposed to the first overly confident, zealous scribe who supports Matthew's case and becomes a disciple of Jesus, we have now a hesitant disciple. This disciple comes to Jesus with some hesitation about continuing to follow Jesus right now. I have a significant excuse. My father died. I had a big loss in my family. And so he asked Jesus to release him. But while Jesus gave the scribe cause to not follow him, here Jesus will not release the man from following him. He says, "Leave your father where he is and let the dead bury the dead." With these two disciples working out just what it means to follow Jesus, we'll come next week to the miracles that consider what is the cost of discipleship. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? And so next week, we'll look at the chaos miracles, the 2 chaos miracles.